were you guys, because I know Kurt was very vocal about thinking that Nevermind, yes, huge hit, but he thought the production was too slick. And that is something that he said at the time. He may have changed his mind about that later on had he lived.
It must have been like 1989, 1990, and we were cruising in this van, and I think we were listening to Surfer Rosa. And Kurt was sitting there in the chair, and he raises his finger and makes a decree. He goes, "This shall be our snare sound." And so that's
Surfer Rosa, the Pixies.
The Pixies, Surfer Rosa, yeah. So that's
made by yours truly.
Yes.
Over there.
And then that's there you go. That we ended up in working with Steve.
So that's...
Well, this is, you know what I think? I think, as you were talking earlier about feeling uncomfortable with this new world of Nirvana fame and stuff like that. And I think that when things did become huge, that we all sort of kind of retreated and sort of clung to the things that we felt most attached to, whether it was weird old cars or going back to Virginia or whatever it may have been for Kurt. But always musically, I think that whether it was Kurt feeling like Nevermind may have been too overproduced or something, we had always listened to records that Steve had made. I remember when I first moved in with Kurt, I think he only had like 4 records. It was like, well, he had a Mark Lanigan record, there was Surfer Rosa, there was a Breeders' Pod, and a Jesus Lizard record. And that was just the sound that we felt most, that we loved. And I think we had probably wanted to work with Steve before we made Nevermind, but we wound up making it with Butch.
Who,
it should be said, is no slouch.
Butch Vig as the producer on Nevermind.
Yeah.
And you know, what you're bringing up is that kind of in the background all along, there was this sound that Steve Albini was getting with the Pixies, with the Breeders, that spoke to you guys. And so my question for you guys is, what is that sound? Okay, it's the snare. Is it the recording of the drums, or is it something bigger than that?
I think it's it's the collective sound of all of those things, where not one seems to be kind of in front of the other. It's almost like, to me, it always sounds really centered, where it's like the vocal isn't jumping ahead of everything else, or things are like riding up and down. It sounds like the sound of a group in a space, and really just natural, you know? I mean, I think, who was it that talked about distance in recording?
Well, Steve will talk your ear off.
Well, yeah, but like how distance kind of
thing.
Yeah, I am a
creates
punisher
depth.
about this stuff.
Right.
And so if you listen to a lot of the drum sounds with Steve's stuff, there is sort of this sense of distance in a way that gives the sound more depth. That's what I think.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but Steve, it felt like what you were going for and what you were about was you wanted the band to sound like the band. You wanted them to sound like, this is how they sound when they're in a room and they're together and something real is happening. You don't want all that separation. You don't want double tracking. You don't want a lot of falderall and nonsense.
Well, there seems to be setting up as a kind of a compare and contrast between me and Butch Vig. And I should point out that Butch Vig's production aesthetic and his like approach as an engineer was like formed in precisely the same way that mine was, doing budget records for dead broke bands in a short amount of time, like trying to be as efficient as possible with not just with the time, but with the materials. And like, you know, you're hitting your snare drum head so hard, we're going to have to buy a new snare drum head, you know? So like, let me put some gaffer on there or something to keep so that we don't split the snare drum head. That, like, his aesthetic and his techniques are very much in the same school as mine. I have a ton of respect for Butch. He and I felt a kind of friendly competition with him before he started making big famous records, before he made records with bands like Nirvana. He and I were making records with a lot of the same bands, like kindred bands. They would do one record with me and one record with Butch, or like, he would do a Killdozer record and a De Kreutzen record, and then I would do a Killdozer record and a De Kreutzen record. It was like the same clientele, the same peer group, the same circles. And what the thing that I remember most about the Nirvana Butch connection is that when we got to the studio to start work on the In Utero album, Kurt had a cassette of the rough mix that Butch had given him of the Nevermind sessions. It wasn't the finished album that was in the stores. It was the cassette of the tracks that Butch had done without any like fanciful mixing, without any just like, these are the tracks. And he played that to get familiar with the sound of the studio. He played it through the speakers, and I thought it sounded fucking fantastic. Do you guys know do you remember that?
No.
I thought it sounded fucking great. And I don't remember, forgive me, I don't remember hearing the Nevermind album and thinking, well, this sounds fucking great. It didn't bring to mind any of the records that Butch had done that I was familiar with, that were the records that made his reputation and probably made Nirvana want to work with him in the first place.
So to be fair, to just go back to that time, Nevermind is out. They're the biggest band in the world. They're looking to make their follow-up album. At that time, were you a fan? Were you a fan of Nirvana?
I wasn't super familiar with Nirvana. I had heard like the ubiquitous stuff that was being played on the radio and all the clubs, and like every gig you would go to, as you were loading in, the sound guy would put Nevermind on to crank the PA and balance the PA. So I had heard the album many times, sort of secondhand, right? I wasn't a student of Nirvana. I was familiar with their circle, like all the other bands in Seattle that they were like, compadres with, like the Melvins and the Mudhoney and all those other bands. I knew those bands and I was familiar with the sound, but I couldn't admit to being a fan. I became a fan of Nirvana through the process of working with them and seeing them in action firsthand, because I'd never seen them play live. If I'd ever seen them play live, I'm certain I would have become a fan.
What's amazing is, so the decision is made, we would like Steve Albini to produce this record. And most people, I think anyone else on the planet in that position would have said, please, 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 please. And you write this letter when you find out that they're interested. And this letter is not a please hire me letter. It's a great letter. But it is a I'll do it, but here are my conditions letter, which is first of all, this is
sounds
a
like that
compliment.
Ethereum thing.
Yeah.
Bit,
it is.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is it is it's a bit of a screed about what you believe, and I will do this if you do it on my terms and if you're willing to do it. And then you shockingly say, I'm not taking points on this record. I don't want to do that. You said, I want to be paid like a plumber. Just give me some money up front, but you thought it was immoral to get points in the record.
Yeah. I mean, the way that record producers and recording people are compensated at that time in particular was a trick of accounting that shifted the cost away from the label and toward the band, made the band ultimately responsible for whatever the producer got paid. And it didn't come out of the general proceeds of the record the way it would in an independent label's contract, for example. It came specifically out of the money that would otherwise have gone to the band. Like literally every dollar I would get paid would mean that was a dollar that Dave didn't get, or Chris didn't get, or Kurt didn't get. I mean, that's just the way the accounting works in those kinds of deals. And I think that's ethically untenable. I'll admit that I think less of people who opt to do things that way. I think it's on its face, it's absurd. Like I work on a record for a few days, and then for the rest of your fucking life, you have to keep paying me. Like you give me a chip off of every nickel that you earn.
I'd like you to talk to my agent and my manager, if you would. If you could convert them to that view.